The reality with the Detroit Lions defense in 2025 is that everything at the back end tells a story of how high the ceiling was and how fragile it became once injuries hit. Coming into the season, this team believed it had arguably the best safety duo in the entire NFL. Kirby Joseph was coming off an all-pro level of play, Brian Branch had already established himself as one of the most versatile and instinctive defensive backs in the league, and Kelvin Shepard's defense was built to let those two hunt footballs, disguise coverages, and turn mistakes into momentum-changing plays. For 6 games, that vision was very real. Joseph picked off 3 passes in Detroit's first 6 games. Branch was everywhere with 33 tackles and 5 passes defended, and the Lions jumped out to a 4-2 start looking like a defense that could dictate terms rather than react. Then the season shifted. Joseph's knee injury, which had already been an issue dating back to training camp, worsened and eventually ended his year. In Week 14 against Dallas, Branch tore his Achilles, an injury that not only closed his 2025 season, but immediately cast doubt over his availability for the start of 2026. Just like that, the backbone of the secondary was gone, and what followed was a real test of Detroit's depth and adaptability. Thomas Harper stepped into 9 starts, Avonte Maddox made 3 starts, and both Eric Hallett and Daniel Thomas were asked to start twice. None of this was the original plan, but it became the reality the Lions had to survive. To their credit, this group competed. One of the most overlooked positives from the season is how well Detroit tackled on the back end. The Lions allowed the second fewest yards after the catch in the entire league, giving up 1,539 YAC, trailing only Buffalo. That doesn't happen by accident. It speaks to discipline, angles, and effort, and the safety position was a huge part of that. Maddox, in particular, turned out to be one of Brad Holmes' better free agent signings. His ability to play both cornerback and safety gave the coaching staff flexibility when the injuries piled up, and that versatility mattered more than ever. Harper, meanwhile, showed flashes of upside that make you think there could be more there with proper development. But there's no escaping the downside of losing Joseph and Branch. Shepard's scheme gives safeties freedom to make plays, and that freedom only works when you have elite instincts and range on the field. Detroit got just 6 games of Joseph and Branch together, and the impact of that absence shows up clearly in the numbers. Lions safeties allowed 9 touchdowns in coverage this season, with Joseph, Branch, Harper, Maddox, and Thomas all giving up scores. Even more telling was Detroit's struggle defending the deep ball. The Lions were one of just 10 teams to allow a passer rating over 100 on throws of 21-plus yards downfield, giving up a 109.4 rating. They allowed the most passing yards in the league on those throws, 1,041 yards, with 9 touchdowns and only 3 interceptions. Compare that to the previous season, when Detroit allowed a 76.1 rating on the same types of throws, with just 4 touchdowns and 4 interceptions, and the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Third downs told a similar story. Opponents converted on 3rd and long situations at a rate of 27.4%, ranking Detroit 23rd in the league. When teams faced 3rd and 10 or longer, they converted 16 of 58 attempts. Only Cincinnati and Carolina were worse in that specific area. Those are the moments where having healthy elite safeties who can disguise coverage, close windows, and bait quarterbacks makes all the difference. Now the conversation turns toward the future, and it's complicated. Maddox, Jalen Mills, and Daniel Thomas are all unrestricted free agents. Maddox, who turns 30 in March, feels like a logical candidate to bring back for depth and versatility. At the same time, there are real questions about Joseph's long-term health and how Branch will look coming back from a major Achilles injury, which typically requires 9 to 12 months of recovery. Brad Holmes has already said he expects Joseph to be able to play in 2026 with proper rehab and treatment, but expectations don't eliminate uncertainty. That uncertainty is why it feels increasingly likely the Lions will add both a veteran and a young player at safety. The upcoming free agent class is deep and experienced, with names like Kobe Bryant, Cameron Curl, Jalen Hawkins, Brian Cook, Julian Blackmon, Alohi Gilman, and Donovan Wilson scheduled to hit the market. The draft also looms large. Caleb Downs out of Ohio State is viewed as the best safety in the 2026 class, but with Detroit currently picking at number 17, he may be out of reach. That pushes attention toward later first round and day 2 options such as Emmanuel McNeil-Warren, Dylan Thieneman, Kyle Lewis, A.J. Halsey, Kamari Ramsey, and Zakee Wheatley.
This is where the Lions are right now, a team that has seen how dominant its defense can be when the back end is healthy, and how vulnerable it becomes when it's not. The decisions Brad Holmes makes at safety this offseason could shape not just the defense, but the entire identity of this team moving forward. Do you trust the rehab, the internal growth, and the depth, or do you aggressively reinforce the position knowing how thin the margin really is? What do you think the Lions should prioritize at safety as they build toward 2026? Because when you look deeper, this isn't just about filling a position on the depth chart, it's about protecting the entire structure of the defense. Kelvin Shepard's system depends heavily on trust at safety. It asks those players to read quickly, communicate pre-snap, disguise intentions, and then close space in an instant. When Kirby Joseph and Brian Branch were healthy, that trust was obvious. Quarterbacks hesitated. Windows felt tighter. Detroit could afford to be aggressive up front because the back end could clean things up. Once that security blanket disappeared, the ripple effect was immediate, and opposing offenses knew exactly where to attack. That's why the conversation around Joseph's health matters so much. Brad Holmes made it clear after the season that Joseph wasn't lacking effort or desire. In fact, it was the opposite. He wanted to be on the field, especially after earning his extension, and that urgency to get healthy during the season is precisely why the team waited as long as it did before placing him on injured reserve. The encouraging part is that now, Joseph finally has the time to focus purely on rehab and treatment without the pressure of rushing back week to week. The Lions believe that matters, and they believe he can return in 2026 as close to his best version as possible. But belief doesn't erase risk, especially when you're talking about a knee that flared up early and lingered all year. Brian Branch's situation brings a different kind of uncertainty. An Achilles injury isn't just about timeline, it's about explosiveness, confidence, and how a player responds once they're back in live action. Branch's game is built on quick reactions, burst, and physicality. Even if he's cleared early in the season, the Lions have to be realistic about what the first few months might look like. That's not a knock on Branch. It's simply the nature of the injury, and it forces Detroit to plan as if they may not have the full version of him right away. This is where roster construction becomes critical. Avonte Maddox showed how valuable versatility can be when everything starts to unravel. Being able to slide between cornerback and safety gave the Lions options when injuries stacked up, and that flexibility is something Brad Holmes clearly values. Re-signing Maddox wouldn't be about finding a star, it would be about stability, insurance, and having someone the coaching staff already trusts to execute the scheme. At the same time, relying solely on internal options would feel risky given what 2025 exposed. Adding a veteran safety isn't about panic, it's about margin for error. Someone who has seen different systems, understands leverage, and can settle things down on the back end when games get chaotic. Pair that with a young player from the draft who can develop without being forced into an immediate starting role, and suddenly the room looks a lot healthier. It also allows Detroit to manage snaps early in the season if Joseph or Branch need to be eased back rather than thrown straight into heavy workloads. All of this points to one clear takeaway from 2025. When the Lions' safeties are right, this defense can be among the most complete units in the league. When they're not, the weaknesses become very visible, especially against explosive passing offenses and in critical third down situations. The front office now has a full season of evidence showing both extremes, and that clarity is powerful if it's used correctly. This offseason isn't about overreacting to injuries, but it is about respecting how quickly things can change in the NFL. Detroit has built something real, and the margin between controlling games and chasing them can be as thin as one position group staying healthy. How Brad Holmes balances faith in his stars with smart reinforcement will tell us a lot about where this team believes its championship window truly is. And even beyond the names and the contracts, this whole discussion really comes down to lessons learned. The 2025 season didn't expose a lack of talent. It exposed how thin the margin is when elite players at premium positions go down. Detroit didn't suddenly forget how to defend. It lost the freedom to be aggressive. Once the safeties couldn't rotate as seamlessly or close ground as quickly, quarterbacks became more comfortable taking shots downfield, especially in those 21-plus-yard situations that completely flipped from a strength the year before into a glaring weakness. That's why the draft conversation is so important, even if the Lions don't land a top-tier prospect. Bringing in a young safety who can learn behind veterans, absorb the system, and grow without being rushed is exactly how you prevent a repeat of what happened. In 2025, Detroit didn't always have that luxury. Injuries forced players into roles before they were fully ready, and while the effort was there, the results showed the gap between surviving and thriving. Planning ahead now means the next injury doesn't derail the entire back end of the defense. It also reinforces how central communication is to this unit. Safeties are the traffic controllers of the defense. When Joseph and Branch were healthy, coverage busts were rare, angles were clean, and the Lions limited yards after the catch better than almost anyone in the league. That didn't disappear because of scheme, it faded because continuity disappeared. Rebuilding that continuity, whether through re-signings, veteran additions, or draft picks, has to be one of the quiet priorities of the offseason. The encouraging part is that this front office has already shown it understands value and fit. Maddox wasn't a flashy signing, but he mattered. Depth players weren't stars, but they kept the defense functional under extreme circumstances. Now the challenge is taking that baseline and raising it so the defense doesn't just hold on when adversity hits, but still dictates games. This is the moment where Detroit decides whether 2025 was a warning or just a stepping stone. The talent is there. The system is there. What happens next at safety could be the difference between a defense that bends under pressure and one that closes games when it matters most. And that's why this position group quietly sits at the center of everything Detroit wants to accomplish next. You can talk about pass rush, you can talk about corners, but the safeties are the bridge between those units. When that bridge is strong, the defense feels fast, confident, and connected. When it cracks, everything behind it feels exposed. The 2025 season gave the Lions a clear, sometimes uncomfortable, look at both realities. What stands out is that the issues weren't constant across the entire year. Early on, with Joseph and Branch on the field, Detroit looked like a defense that could win games on its own. Takeaways were coming, tackles were secure, and quarterbacks were being forced to check the ball down. Later in the season, without that stability, opponents were more willing to wait for deeper routes to develop, and that patience paid off. The spike in deep passing yards and touchdowns allowed wasn't random. It was a direct response to who was and wasn't on the field. This makes the offseason plan feel less like a luxury and more like a necessity. The Lions don't need to overhaul the safety room, but they do need to insulate it. Betting everything on perfect health after what just happened would be ignoring the clearest lesson of the season. At the same time, abandoning faith in Joseph and Branch would also be a mistake. The balance is in support, not replacement. Depth that can play, experience that can steady the room, youth that can grow without being forced to carry the unit before it's ready. Brad Holmes' comments about Joseph tell you a lot about how the organization views this. There's respect for the player, understanding of the situation, and confidence that time and proper rehab can change the outcome. That kind of patience is important, but patience still needs a safety net. The Lions are in a window where every season matters, and protecting that window means preparing for scenarios you hope never happen. When you zoom out, this is actually a good problem to have. Detroit isn't searching for an identity on defense. It has one. It just needs to make sure that identity survives adversity. The safeties are the keystone of that plan, and how the Lions approach this offseason will tell us whether 2025 truly sharpened their focus or simply tested their depth. And the deeper you go into it, the more it feels like 2025 was a stress test the Lions didn't ask for, but probably needed. It forced the coaching staff and front office to see exactly where the floor is if things don't go perfectly. Not in theory, not on paper, but in real game situations against real opponents who adjusted quickly once they sensed vulnerability. That kind of information is valuable, especially for a team that believes it's building towards something sustainable, not just chasing one good year. What also can't be ignored is how much mental pressure gets placed on the rest of the defense when the safeties aren't settled. Linebackers hesitate a split second longer. Corners feel like they have to protect against everything. Pass rushers lose the luxury of all-out aggression because one missed lane can turn into an explosive play. None of that shows up cleanly in individual stats, but it shows up on film and in key moments of games. The Lions lived that reality down the stretch. That's why continuity matters just as much as talent. If Joseph comes back healthy and Branch returns close to his pre-injury form, the Lions instantly regain that sense of order on the back end. Communication tightens. Disguises work again. Those third and long situations start leaning back in Detroit's favor instead of the offense's. But continuity can't be fragile. It has to be supported, and that's the next step for this roster. This isn't about fear. It's about maturity as an organization. Championship-level teams don't assume health. They plan around uncertainty. Detroit now has first-hand experience showing how quickly a strength can turn into a vulnerability, and how much that swing can affect the entire season. The good news is they don't have to guess anymore. The blueprint is right in front of them. As this offseason unfolds, every move at safety will feel small on the surface, but the impact could be massive once the games start. Whether it's a veteran addition, a draft pick, or a smart re-signing, the goal is simple. Make sure the defense never loses its backbone again. And when you frame it that way, the safety discussion stops being about one offseason and starts being about philosophy. The Lions are no longer in a phase where they can afford to learn the same lesson twice. They've seen how quickly momentum can swing when a core position group is compromised, and they've also seen how much harder it becomes